This video will go over physical development in adolescence. Particularly, we'll be looking at puberty, brain development, changes in sleep, nutritional concerns, and eating disorders, as well as adolescent pregnancy. So first off, let's clarify a few terms. So the difference between adolescence and puberty. Adolescence refers to the transition between childhood and adulthood. So going from a child to taking on the full roles and responsibilities of an adult. And it is began by puberty, the flood of biological events leading to an adult-sized body and sexual maturity. The widespread view of adolescence as a time of storm and stress goes back to the early 20th century theorist G. Stanley Hall, who once said that adolescence is so turbulent, it resembles the era in which humans evolved from savages into civilized beings. Although certain problems do occur more often in adolescence, the overall rate of serious psychological disturbance rises only slightly from childhood to adolescence. Anthropologist Margaret Mead promoted the view that the social environment is entirely responsible for the range of teenage experiences, both negative and positive. So taking a more balanced view, we recognize that biological, psychological, and social forces combine to influence adolescent development. The length of adolescence and its demands and pressures differs widely among cultures. Most tribal and village societies have only a brief intervening phase between childhood and adulthood. So very quickly, once puberty hits, they are transitioning into taking on full adult roles and responsibilities, compared to industrialized societies where it tends to be much more drawn out. Genetically influenced hormonal processes regulate pubertal growth. Girls generally reach puberty on average 2 years earlier than boys. The hormonal changes underlying puberty are underway by 8 or 9 years of age, when secretions of growth hormone and thyroxine increase, leading to the enormous gains in body size and to the attainment of skeletal maturity. Sexual maturation controlled by the sex hormones, both estrogen and androgens. And so even though estrogens are commonly thought of as female hormones and androgens are often thought of as male hormones, both are present in males and females, just in different concentrations, different amounts. For boys, the testes will release large quantities of the androgen testosterone, leading to muscle growth, body and facial hair, and other male sexual characteristics. Estrogens cause girls' breasts, uterus, and vagina to mature, the body to take on feminine proportions, and fat to start to accumulate. Estrogens also contribute to the regulation of the menstrual cycle. Adrenal androgens, androgens that are made by the adrenal glands, which sit atop our kidneys, influence girls' height spurt and stimulate the growth of underarm and pubic hair. However, they have little impact on boys' physical characteristics. Pubertal changes are often thought of in two broad types: overall body growth and maturation of sexual characteristics. The hormones responsible for sexual maturity also impact body growth. So one of the first outward signs of puberty is the rapid gain in height and weight called the growth spurt. Adolescents add 10 to 11 inches in height and 50 to 75 pounds in weight. Growth starts at 12.5 for boys and 10 for girls on average, and completes for most boys by 17.5 and most girls by 16. At first, growth of the hands, legs, and feet accelerates, and then the torso, making the early adolescent appear out of proportion. And so this is referring to that distal proximal development. Prenatally and through childhood, we had the opposite happening, proximal distal, where the torso and the head were developing faster than the extremities. Adolescence, puberty hitting, we see a switch where the extremities start developing a lot faster than the torso. And many teens kind of have a gangly look, right? The very long arms and legs in proportion to their body as their body starts to then catch up later. We also see large differences in body proportions by sex. For boys, their shoulders are typically broadening relative to their hips. In girls, the hips broaden relative to the shoulders and waist. Around the age of 8, girls start to add fat on their arms, legs, and trunk, a trend that accelerates from age 11 to 16, while boys' arm and leg fat starts to decrease. Boys also tend to develop larger skeletal muscles, hearts, lung capacity, and number of red blood cells compared to girls, and that allows for better aerobic efficiency. In adolescence, changes occur in both our primary sexual characteristics and our secondary sexual characteristics. Primary sexual characteristics are the ones that directly involve the reproductive organs. So the penis, the testes, the uterus, the vagina, those are our primary sexual characteristics. Secondary sexual characteristics are all of the other visible signs of sexual maturity. So for males, things like having facial hair, a lower voice, broad shoulders. For females, things like breast development, wider hips. For everyone, underarm and pubic hair development. Some of those other outward signs that are not actually reproductive organs, right? So female puberty usually begins with the budding of the breast and the growth spurt. Menarche, or first menstrual cycle, typically occurs at about 12 and a half on average for North American girls and 13 for Western European girls. In boys, the first sign of puberty is the enlargement of the testes, accompanied by changes in the scrotum. Pubic hair emerges soon after, and about the same time, the penis begins to enlarge. The growth spurt in boys peaks at around age 14. Spermarchy, or first ejaculation, usually occurs around age 13 and a half. There is variation in the timing of puberty, and it has different impacts on development. So heredity contributes substantially to the timing of puberty, and nutrition and exercise have an effect as well. In girls, a sharp rise in body weight and fat may trigger sexual maturation through the release of a protein called leptin, which is believed to signal to the brain that the girl's energy stores are sufficient for puberty, are sufficient for carrying a pregnancy potentially. In poverty-stricken regions where malnutrition and infectious disease are common, however, menarche is greatly delayed. In industrialized nations where food is abundant, heredity and environment jointly influence pubertal growth. Early family experiences may also contribute to the timing of puberty. So some studies have found evidence that threats to emotional health accelerated puberty, although there have been criticisms of these studies. The existence of a secular trend or generational change in pubertal timing lends added support to the role of physical well-being in pubertal development. In industrialized nations, age of menarche has declined from 16 to about 13 over the last 100 years, a time in which public health improved greatly. And as developing nations make more socioeconomic progress, they also show that secular trend. In the United States and some European countries, soaring rates of overweight and obesity are helping to sustain the trend as well. So the impact of timing of puberty is very much linked to society's view of what is attractive. So society's view of an attractive female tends to be thin, long-legged, consistent with the girlish shape of a later developer. The good-looking male image, tall, broad-shouldered, and muscular, fits with that early maturing boy. Um, Body image or our conception of and attitude towards physical appearance is a strong predictor of young people's self-esteem, and the negative effects of pubertal timing on body image are greatly amplified when other stressors are present too. Adolescents typically feel most comfortable with peers who match their own level of biological maturity. So early maturing adolescents of both sexes typically seek out older companions who often encourage them into activities they're not ready to handle emotionally. Hormonal influences on the brain's emotional social network are stronger for early maturers, and this further magnifies their receptiveness to sexual activity, drug and alcohol use, and delinquent activities. While both early maturing boys and girls are at risk of developing problems, early maturing boys appear somewhat advantaged. Both adults and their peers tend to view them as relaxed, independent, self-confident, and physically attractive. Early maturing girls are more likely to be unpopular, withdrawn, lacking in self-confidence, and anxious. And these trends reflect how closely the adolescent's body matches cultural ideals of physical attractiveness and how well young people fit in physically with their peers. Early maturing girls are more at risk of lasting difficulties compared to their on-time counterparts. In boys, early maturation tended to only be a temporary stressor unless it was also paired with a rapid tempo of development. So not only were they beginning puberty early, but they were progressing through puberty fast. And this increased risk of depression and substance use. Interventions targeting at-risk early maturing youths help them handle the emotional and social challenges of the teen years. For late maturing boys tend to fare worse than late maturing girls. They're commonly considered less attractive and are physically disadvantaged in sports. And these things can decrease their self-esteem. If late maturing boys learn to cope, it will contribute to positive gains in adulthood like assertiveness, self-insight. If they do not learn how to effectively cope, then that diminished self-esteem can extend into adulthood. Late maturing girls tend to have a more positive experience overall. They may sometimes be overlooked in dating and have lower social status, but they tend to have fewer emotional problems as they fit society's idealized, slender, leggy body type. All of these changes in our bodies, in and outside of our bodies due to puberty, tends to draw teens' attention to their gender. Some adolescents may emphasize or engage in activities that are in line with traditional gender roles in order to gain acceptance and approval from their peers. Not all teens are affected by gender role intensification to the same extent or across various situations. In terms of brain development, neuroimaging research has revealed continuing pruning of unused synapses in the cerebral cortex, especially the prefrontal cortex during this time. Remember, prefrontal cortex, the area right behind the forehead. So as connections between the prefrontal cortex and other areas in our cerebral cortex, as well as the inner brain, expand and attain rapid communication, adolescents are gaining in controlling their impulses, organization, planning, reasoning, problem solving, and decision making. But because, their prefrontal cognitive control network still requires fine tuning, their performance on tasks requiring inhibition, planning, and delay of gratification is not yet fully mature. Because of changes in the brain's emotional social network, teens tend to react more strongly to stressful events, and they experience pleasurable stimuli more intensely. This is partly due to the limbic system. The limbic system regulates emotion and rewards and our hormones. It develops faster than our prefrontal cortex. It also drives attraction to novelty or to new things. Teens are especially sensitive to dopamine, the major reward neurotransmitter, and so they tend to respond to potential rewards, even if the behavior may be quite risky. Oxytocin is a neurotransmitter that facilitates bonding and makes social connections more rewarding. And the combination of dopamine and oxytocin really drives adolescents to seek peer approval and to experience group inclusion as very rewarding. Conversely, they also experience peer rejection and group exclusion as intensely painful. The National Sleep Foundation recommends adolescents get 8 to 10 hours of sleep. However, this is rare. So most adolescents do not get enough sleep, especially among older adolescents. Only 9% of teenagers are getting optimal sleep. And there are a lot of negative consequences for not getting enough sleep. Feeling tired, cranky, more likely to have depressed mood, increased use of stimulants like caffeine and nicotine, increased risk of substance abuse, car crashes, poor academic achievement, greater risk of obesity, and a weakened immune system. Not getting enough sleep is also a predictor of increased risk-taking behaviors. So teens do seem to start to want to go to bed later and wake up later, and that is actually due to changes in their circadian rhythms. So circadian rhythms are essentially some of our biological processes that change according to a roughly 24-hour time span. So things like our body temperature, the amount of melatonin that's secreted, which is a very important hormone for feeling sleepy and relaxed. And these things are following a roughly 24-hour cycle. For teens, they will start to experience sleepiness later in the evening compared to when they were children, and then they also want to sleep in longer. And we'll see a flip of that in adulthood, particularly as we get into late adulthood, where that circadian rhythm, we start feeling changes again to where we start feeling sleepy much earlier in the evening. Adolescent sexual activity. At about 8 to 11 years of age, most children will start to experience increased sexual attraction. More than half of US adolescents become sexually active during high school, with the average age of first sexual experience being 17, roughly. The live birth rate in 2018 for 15 to 19-year-olds was 17.4 per 1,000, which is a substantial decrease since 1991, which was the most recent peak. So teens seem to be much less sexually active, and those who are sexually active seem to be using contraceptives, and that's why we've seen such a decline in the birth rate among teens. Adolescent pregnancy is more likely if a parent and their teen aren't close, if there's a lack of parental supervision, parents' values regarding teen intercourse or unprotected intercourse play a role as well. If you live in a dangerous neighborhood or have lower socioeconomic status, if you live in a single parent household, if you have older siblings who are sexually active or pregnant, if you experience early puberty, and or if you're sexually abused, those things increase the likelihood of adolescent pregnancy. There are consequences for adolescent parents. One of the most concerning being that they are less likely to graduate high school. So only 40% of teens with a child before the age of 18 will graduate. Those who do graduate high school tend to have lower educational attainment than those who are older when they become parents. So many will not go on to college or a trade school. And less education limits job prospects. It makes it more difficult to be financially independent. So many adolescent parents live in poverty and require public assistance. There are consequences for the child as well. The child of an adolescent parent is more likely to repeat a grade, to do poorly on standardized tests, to drop out of high school, and to become a teen parent themselves. Switching over to talking about nutrition and eating, the rapid body growth in adolescence leads to a dramatic increase in nutritional requirements at a time when the diets of many teens are at their worst. Common nutritional problems include deficiencies of iron, calcium, riboflavin, and magnesium. The frequency of family meals is strongly associated with healthier eating patterns in teenagers. Getting into disorders, not just nutrient deficiencies, eating disorders most frequently occur during adolescence or early adulthood. Although both sexes experience eating disorders, females are 2.5 times more likely to have one compared to males. Boys and men are more likely to experience muscle dysmorphia, a distortion of one's body image in which an individual sees themselves as weak, even when they're quite muscular, and has an extreme desire to increase their muscle mass. So getting to the common eating disorders of adolescence, anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorder. So anorexia nervosa is an eating disorder in which young people starve themselves because of an extreme fear of becoming fat. It affects about 1% of North American and Western European teen girls, and cases have increased sharply in the past 50 years, fueled by cultural admiration of female thinness. Boys account for only 10 to 15% of anorexia cases. Individuals with anorexia have an extremely distorted body image, seeing themselves as too heavy even after they have become severely underweight. Individuals with anorexia lose between 25 and 50% of their body weight. Like those with anorexia, people with bulimia nervosa are pathologically anxious about gaining weight. They also engage in strict dieting and excessive exercise, but it's also accompanied by binge eating episodes. Periods where they will eat a very large amount of calories in a very short period of time. Individuals often report they feel out of control while this happens. Afterwards, they feel guilty, depressed, upset for slipping in their diets. And so they will then try to purge by inducing vomiting, misusing laxatives, fasting, exercising excessively, things like that, to try to counter the calories that they took in during a binge episode. Bulimia typically appears in late adolescence, whereas anorexia is more likely to be diagnosed in early adolescence. Bulimia is also more common than anorexia, affecting 2 to 4% of teenage girls. Many with bulimia nervosa are impulsive, sensation-seeking, and lack control in other areas of their lives. Binge eating disorder is similar to bulimia, where there are binges that happen, but there are no purging compensatory behaviors following a binge. So if you are binging at least once a week for 3 months or longer without compensatory purging, exercise, fasting, that's typically how binge eating disorder is diagnosed. It affects 2 to 3% of teen girls and almost 1% of teen boys. So what about risk factors? Many factors interact to increase one's risk of developing an eating disorder. Girls who reach puberty early, who are very dissatisfied with their body image, and who grow up in homes where concern with weight and thinness are very high, are at risk for developing eating problems. Genetic factors and differences in patterns of brain activity also contribute to the development of an eating disorder. Consequences for anorexia. People with anorexia are at risk for a variety of health consequences. About 5% die every year, either due to physical complications or to suicide. It is one of the is one of the deadliest psychological disorders, behind, I think, only opioid use disorder. Um, and so part of that is because the the extreme amount of damage that is done to the body when you don't eat. Your body essentially eats itself, so it starts taking nutrients from, once you run out of fat stores, it's going to start taking nutrients from your bones and your organs. And so that leads to quite serious problems like heart failure or other organ failure, osteoporosis. And even if you get treatment and you are starting to put back on weight, a lot of the times the damage to those organs is permanent. For people with bulimia nervosa, they can also have organ problems if they are engaging in forcing themselves to vomit. That's where we're likely to see additional consequences like having a ruptured esophagus or and tooth decay due to stomach acid. For binge eating disorder, it leads to being overweight or obese and the related health problems that go along with having excess weight. So things like high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, things like that. Binge eating disorder has also been associated with social adjustment difficulties, severe emotional distress, and suicidal thoughts. So how are eating disorders treated? The most successful treatments for anorexia include the Maudsley approach, which is a family-based treatment where parents are actively involved in their child's treatment, such as taking responsibility for feeding the child. Medication may also be used to reduce anxiety and neurotransmitter imbalances. In contrast to people with anorexia, people with bulimia usually feel depressed and guilty about their abnormal eating habits, which actually makes it easier to treat compared to anorexia. People with anorexia often don't see a problem with their eating behaviors. And so they, if you don't see a problem with your behavior, you're unlikely to change it. So with bulimia, people with bulimia typically realize this is a problematic behavior pattern. Treatment may include cognitive behavioral therapy to assist in identifying distorted thinking patterns and changing inaccurate beliefs to eliminate binge eating and purging behaviors. Support groups are common, nutritional education, and then sometimes also medication as well to deal with any neurotransmitter imbalances. Effective treatment for binge eating disorder, very similar to that used for bulimia. So using cognitive behavioral therapy, support groups, nutrition education, and sometimes medication as well. So that wraps up physical development in adolescence.